All right, today we are diving into Quiet, the hidden power of introverts. We're going to explore this hidden force that, honestly, shapes everything from our schools to our workplaces, even how we feel about ourselves.
So let me ask you something right off the bat. Have you ever been at a party or maybe a work meeting and had that little voice in your head say, ugh, I should really be more outgoing? If you've ever felt that, well, you are definitely not alone, and there's a fascinating reason for it.
You know that feeling of not being outgoing enough it's incredibly common. I mean, get this. This thought right here. This came from a super successful lawyer, right in the middle of a high-stakes negotiation. Even at the absolute top of their game, they felt that pressure to be someone else.
And it turns out there's a name for this pressure we all feel. Our world, our whole culture, is basically dominated by what's called an extrovert ideal. But here's the kicker. What if that's only half the story? What if, by focusing on that, we're missing out on a huge source of power and talent?
All right, so let's get into it. The extrovert ideal. What is this thing, really? And why does our culture seem to celebrate the person who speaks up the loudest?
So the extrovert ideal is basically this belief that's everywhere. This idea that the ideal person is gregarious, they're an alpha, totally comfortable in the spotlight. Think about it. From the time we're kids, we're kind of taught that success means being a great talker, a big team player, the one who's always ready to jump into the center of the action.
But here's what's so interesting. It wasn't always like this, not even close. To figure out how we got here, we've got to go back in time and look at this huge shift in how America decided who to admire.
Okay, so picture this. It's the early 1900s. America is moving from a nation of farms to a nation of big cities and corporations. And with that shift, a new kind of hero was born, the salesman. The story of Dale Carnegie is the perfect example. Here's this anxious young guy who was terrified of being tongue-tied, but he looked around and had this epiphany. The campus leaders, the popular ones, were the public speakers. So, what did he do? He totally transformed himself, mastered public speaking, moved to New York, and his classes became an absolute sensation. His story is really the story of the country at that time.
And you can literally see this change in the words people used. We went from what was called a culture of character, where we admired things like morals, duty, integrity, to a culture of personality. Suddenly, it was all about being magnetic, fascinating, charismatic. The focus shifted from what was inside a person to how they presented themselves to the world. And this wasn't just a change in vocabulary. It completely changed who got hired, who got promoted, who we saw as leaders.
So, this new culture personality gave birth to a really powerful myth, especially at work, the collaboration myth. This idea that great thinking only happens in groups. But is that really true?
I mean, you see it everywhere, right? The open plan offices where you can't get a moment of peace, the classrooms where all the desks are pushed into little pods. The common wisdom is that if you want the best ideas, you gotta get everyone in a room to brainstorm together.
But here's where it gets really interesting. The data? It tells a completely different story. Check this out. A landmark study done at 3M found something incredible. Individuals who worked alone and then pooled their ideas together came up with way more ideas and higher quality ideas than the groups who brainstorm face-to-face. It turns out that solitude isn't a bug, it's a feature. It's a crucial ingredient for innovation. Okay, so if this extrovert ideal is flawed and the whole group brainstorming thing isn't the magic bullet we thought it was, what are we missing? Well, it's time we talk about the power of quiet. Let's discover the incredible strength that comes from sensitivity and solitude.
Let's look at a perfect example. Eleanor Roosevelt. By all accounts, she was publicly shy, even struggled with self-doubt. But she didn't try to be someone she wasn't. Instead, she used her quiet nature as a superpower. Get this. In just 3 months, she traveled 40,000 miles, not to give big speeches, but to listen to the stories of ordinary Americans. She became the conscience for her husband, the president, and risked her own reputation to fight for things like racial justice. That's quiet power.
And it's so important to remember, this whole preference for being outspoken, it's not a universal human truth, it's a cultural value. If you look at many Eastern cultures, it's the opposite. They've long admired quiet contemplation and deep listening. You see it in their proverbs. This idea that the loudest person in the room is the leader, that's actually a pretty modern and very Western idea. So what do we do with all this? How do we create a world that values both styles? Well, it's all about finding our balance. So how do we embrace this power of quiet in our own lives? First, and this is huge, you have to honor your own style. If you're an introvert, stop feeling guilty about skipping that party to read a book. That's you recharging.
Seek out what are called restorative niches, those quiet spots where you can get back to being yourself after you'd had to be on. And for anyone who's a manager or a parent, please don't mistake quiet for disinterest. It's on us to create space for everyone to contribute their ideas, not just the people who shout the loudest. So I'll leave you with this final thought. In a world that's constantly telling us to be louder, to be more outgoing, what great ideas are we missing? What amazing solutions and talents are just sitting there, waiting to be heard? What great idea is waiting, right now, in the quiet?